fuck did I just do that? Why did I do that, bruv? Can I just go there? No. Alright, now we're back there. The poet Edgar Allan Poe. Alien Angel by Jerome McGann. See if the video is good. Looks lovely, bruv. Looks lovely. Looks lovely. Now open the chat. We'll open the chat, bruv. Oh man, that was loud. Alright, the poet Edgar Allan Poe, Alien Angel, Jerome McGann, Chapter 4. The politics of a poetry without politics. Yes, forsooth, I wish you joy of the worm. Shakespeare, Antony, and Cleopatra. What do you got, bruv? TFF. What is that? TFF. The FF? What the FF? Although Poe's career spanned a seriously fractious and volatile period, he rarely comments on the social and political events of his time. His difference in this respect from Bryant, Cooper, Lowell, Longfellow, and the Transcendentalist circle is striking. Poe's public interests are intense, but they are also narrowly circumscribed and media-directed. As his long passion to found a distinguished literary and cultural journal shows. When he does comment, however, he doesn't mince words, nor does he set himself apart from judgment. What do you got, bruvs? We're all bruvs. We of the 19th century need some worker of miracles for our regeneration, but so degraded have we become that the only prophet or preacher who could render us much service would be the Saint Francis who converted the beasts. Marginalia, June 1849 by Poe, obviously, since this book is about Poe. Because he rarely descends to detail or even general comment on contemporary events, the political importance of Poe's work is easy to mistake. For all his admiration of Shelley, he is not that kind of missioned spirit. He is skeptical, often contemptuous of enlightened social views, yet he had a far deeper understanding of the vulgarity, hypocrisy, and violence of antebellum America than Francis Trollope, whichever it is, or the other European visitors who so annoyed Americans with their critical reports. He had an insider's view, but he was more than an alien resident. He was an alienated player, as active and even unscrupulous in advancing his special interests as anyone. That complex antithetical position has often been held against him, and against his poetry in particular, especially by the authorities of high culture. Even when a reader tries to meet him on even footing, as J.T. Barbaris recently did in an otherwise very attractive essay, the terms are unequal. For Barbaris, The Sleeper, which Poe regarded as his greatest poem, is simply hack work, a mishmash of romantic cliches and figural commonplaces. Like so many, Barbaris has a quarrel with Poe's tools. As with Schopenhauer, Poe is a world of will and representation. It is, like Schopenhauer's, a world of darkness because it is mapped to the illusions that organized his world. Its foundational ideologies. That focus, Poe's special map, has serious critical virtues. Two in particular are notable because they are so characteristic of his work. First, the discourse of popular culture defines Poe's poetic discourse which often draws upon the grammars and dictionaries of sensibility in their most recent romantic editions, very much trade editions. Like his cultural contemporaries, popular as well as critical, Cole, Poe is an assiduous student of English Romanticism as it rises in Wordsworth and Coleridge and peaks in Shelley. Moore, Keats, and Byron, and finally in Tennyson's romantic doom. His poetry is often deplored as impossibly abstract. And what's the title say? The poet Edgar Allan Poe. Alien Angel by Jerome McGann. His poetry is often deplored as impossibly abstract and derivative, a spilled and threadbare romanticism. The charge is understandable, even correct in a way, but finally misconceived. Or perhaps I should say that it refuses to read in the same spirit that the author writ. It issues from a vantage like that of Ivor Winters, who expects poetic language to have a strong referential content, cognitive or concrete. There you go, fan. You're not going to blow the page anymore. How's that feel? Any remarks? All right, then shut up. But Winters' rationale for that expectation, which rightly draws upon the deliberately memorial character of poetry, has forgotten how memory works in poetic mimesis. Poetry holds a mirror up to the world, the poet's particular world, in the language of that world, which includes the languages it inherits and retransmits. To say in a remote idiom that memory is the mother of the muses is exactly the same as saying in a more contemporary idiom that it is a consciously intertextual discourse. What's up, bruv? Poe's poetry is unusual because it marks itself as such, a mournful and never ending remembrance, haunted in intertext. His discourse is thus grounded in self conscious forms of representation. It is a mediated ideological discourse. These forms are very precise as forms, but like the language of dreams, the forms are encoded. From our point of view, the most important thing about these coded discursions is that they are left uninterpreted at the level of the poetic expression, a provocative condition that has led not a few readers to seek interpretive resolutions for Poe's poetics of opacity, or is it opacity? To provide explanatory devices would be for Poe didactic heresy, and as he knew, didacticism can take many forms, the least insidious being direct moral or political comment. For Poe, the most insidious is conventional narrative and its rules of probability. Poe's poetry has to be read the way we read Rimbaud's, especially the Illuminations. In English, Hart Crane's poetry provides a close analog, as Ivor Winters himself suggested when he applied the same word to Crane's poetry, catastrophe, as to Poe's. Even more interesting is the example of Emily Dickinson, and especially the group of disturbingly impacted poems that David Porter found most characteristic of her modern idiom. Those works set a standard for the difficulties that Dickinson's poetry has never ceased to raise. Obscurities and uncanny effects are staple in all of these writers, as we know, but what makes their work so distinctive is its conscious, even flaunted artifice. Poe, Dickinson, Rimbaud, and Crane mark their obscurities as deliberated fabrications. As such, readers are put on notice that Shelley's veil of familiarity of known poetic conventions is being consciously stripped bare in order to reveal the naked and sleeping beauty which is the spirit of its forms. A Defense of Poetry, Shelley's Poetry in Prose, 505. The result, in Hart Crane's words, is poetry poised at new thresholds and formed of new anatomies. The Wine Menagerie. It calls for an interpretive response that is equal to the self-conscious work that so challenges our attention. When traditional meanings and referential forms are drawn into this poetry, as they always and necessarily are, they become subject to a transvaluation of their customary values. As we've already seen, the engine driving those transvaluations in Poe is a musical composition of hitherto unheard melodies. Unheard, bruvs. To see the poetry as intertextual means seeing it as a medium of the political unconscious. Poems, as Tennyson might say, moan round with many voices that are then resembled in a new poetical present. The intertextuality of Poe's poetry is so unusually naked and insistent, however, that readers are drawn to pay attention not to what the texts mean, but to how those voices, nos semblables, nos frères, obviously awful at French, continue to make meanings for us and we for them. We've discussed this already as the style of Poe's musical formalities, because such an understanding of Poe is fundamental. Because the intertexts have social and historical dimensions, readers are also summoned to notice how these dimensions inflect the poetic meanings. Readers are the ones who finally make poetic meanings, and of course, the poets are their own first readers. The priority of reading signals why we later readers must begin to read in the same spirit that the author writ before we go on to read in any kind of counter spirit. How are you reading the work of these summoned spirits is ultimately the question that the poems are putting to us. The procedure is strongly reminiscent of the challenging effect of Ahab's doubloon. All semiotic forms translate eventual experience into conceptual terms that allow us to reflect and communicate. Imaginative writing, poetry in particular, recovers an experiential engagement with those conceptual translations. Language, rhetoric, bibliography, and media display are always specific to time and place and circumstance. And an alert critical philology can and should expose those specifics and their intertextual connections. In the case of Poe's poetry, the absence of manifest referential content, its aggressively literary and formal qualities, have led many readers to search the poetry for a reliable biographical ground or to seek out coded references to race, politics, and gender. What do you got, bruv? I'm awesome. Where the hell was I now? In the case of Poe's poetry, the absence of manifest referential content, its aggressive literary and formal qualities have led many readers to search the poetry for a reliable biographical ground. Should I start telling jokes? Or to seek out coded references to race, politics, and gender. But in reading Poe, we have to be specially wary of all such moves, since they can so easily lead us to retranslate the work back into conceptual. Poe called them didactic terms. Poe's great subject is poetic representation itself, and the deeper truth is that he takes this to be an imperative social and political subject. And let me give you some hearts. Blissy. There you go. There's some hearts. I guess that's for me. Just poses as for you. Poe's poetic method thus carries a second and even more consequential virtue. though in another, perhaps deeper sense, this virtue is, like Ahab's doubloon, seriously problematic. His discourse holds a mirror up to his contemporary world's hall of mirrors and its will to romantic representation. Consider his notorious misogyny. Unlike Baudelaire's didactical revulsion, Poe's attitude to women fed upon widespread 19th century sentimental ideas. Like nearly all his contemporaries, including many of the period's most prominent women, he cherished an idealized feminine figure, both as Ewig Weiblich. What the hell's that? Ewig Weiblich. Is that German? And as Bella Ideal. His attitude, a legacy of the 18th century's sentimental enlightenment, mirrors his serious interest in and promotion of contemporary women's poetry. The term for this figure, characteristically antebellum, was true woman. Odd as it might seem, this feminine, not feminist mystique has much in common with the thinking of reformers like Mary Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft, how do you say that? Wollstonecraft and Margaret Fuller. On the other hand, no such congruities appear if we compare Poe's views with the Grimke's open and far less compromised campaign to promote women's social and political responsibilities under the rubric of the new woman. Poe had no interest in seeing women enter the public sphere or in promoting women's civic rights. He adhered to the view dominant at the time that women's public function was to reign supreme in the private sphere, but Poe's other and chief interest in the discourse of poetry and imagination turned his retrograde social view into a critical weapon. Helen was the towering. Why does it say Helen or Helen? Aren't they the same? Or is it just because it's parenthesized? Helen was the towering soul presiding in those regions which, our holy land, a mythic counter-world and counterculture bringing judgment to the world, Emerson declared, full of perjury and fraud and 100 commodities. Poe's, infamous instrument of judgment in the imaginative device he drew out of the Dantescan, is that what he's trying to say? Dantescan myth recovered by the Romantics, the death of a beautiful woman. This is Poe's most poetical subject in the world in two respects. First of all, the figure organizes Poe's imaginative world as an ideological condition, a literary and cultural inheritance, an intertext. Secondly, the figure is a gravity field for the cultural condition of the 19th century, the epic of high romanticism and its immediate aftermath. The Raven is not just signature Poe, it is also period signature, as its fame and scandal alike testify. Bird poems are everywhere, from Wordsworth to Hardy, and so are figurations of dead and dying women. So simplified has our thought become about Poe's notorious remark, and so attenuated our memory, that we would do well to reflect on the astonishing array of dead and beautiful women scattered across the field of the 19th century. Even the sentimental figures are scarcely one-dimensional victims, as a quick review of their company will show. Wordsworth's Lucy is nothing like Cooper's Naramata or James's Daisy Miller. The Lady of Shalott and the Blessed Damozel are worlds away from Catherine Earnshaw. Bronte, in fact, should remind us that dead and dying women in the 19th century are often made of disturbing and even fearful stuff. Swinburne's women tout court, Byron's Haidee, and Astarte. I still don't know how to say that. I should have looked it up, but Scott's Ulrica, Poe's Ligeia, Rossetti's Astarte Syriaca, the destruction and death of beautiful women in the 19th century are all moments when the period's imaginative and cultural crises are being exposed. I mean, in defense of these writers, a lot of women and men died young. So, I mean, what else to invoke a poem than your love dying at 25 years old? In this respect, later readers, particularly high modernist readers, might reasonably judge Poe's poetry altogether too historical, even perhaps a reflection of the most debased kind of American Victorianism. Nor is that an unimportant way to read Poe, as Winter's essay shows. Some might take a critical view of this way of reading, as I do, because of its implicit claim to enlightenment, perhaps even historical enlightenment. However, that may be, its partiality in both senses waylays it from access to the more significant and more difficult import of Poe's work, which calls the discourse of poetry itself to the bar of judgment. To dismiss Poe's late romantic posture is to miss or perhaps refuse to accept the troubling Platonic question it raises. What ethical authority can poetry claim when it consciously locates itself in a field of ideological illusions? That was not just Plato's ancient question in charge, it was also the question Whitman posed in 1875 when he found himself reconsidering his long distaste for Poe's writing. A dream of Poe changed his mind. In a dream I once had, I saw a vessel on the sea at midnight. In a storm, it was no great full-rigged ship, nor majestic steamer, steering firmly through the gale, but seemed one of those superb little schooner yachts I had often seen lying anchored, rocking so jauntily in the waters around New York, or up Long Island Sound, now flying uncontrolled with torn sails and broken spars through the wild sleet and winds and waves of the night. On the deck was a slender, slight, beautiful figure, a dim man, apparently enjoying all the terror, the murk, and the dislocation of which he was the center and the victim. That figure of my lurid dream might stand for Edgar Poe, his spirit, his fortunes, and his poems, themselves all lurid dreams. Whitman's dream focuses a larger set of reflection on what he called his age's matter and malady, the pathological condition of 19th century poetic culture. He sets Poe apart both from himself, the great apologist for the idea of a new world, the American system, and from another shape of poetic personality, where the perfect character, the good, the heroic, although never attained, is never lost sight of, but through failures, sorrows, temporary downfalls, is returned to again and again, and while often violated, it passionately adhered to as long as mind, muscles, voice obey the power we call volition. This sort of personality we see more or less in Burns, Byron, Schiller, and George Sand. Those two romantic postures define Whitman's sense of a healthy 19th century culture. Poe's difference from both is radical. With his lurid dreams, Whitman goes on to say he abnegates the perennial and democratic concretes of an age moving to a hoped-for fulfillment in the American dream. Way and system, Poe is unique because he does not set himself apart from the terror, the murk, and the dislocation of the age's pathological culture that Whitman himself had begun to question in Democratic Vistas, 1871. On the contrary, he is its willing center and victim. All of Poe's writing puts its readers to a test of their thinking in that political frame of reference, as scholars of the prose fiction have long understood. The politics of the poetry is less well recognized because Poe's theoretical writings seem to abjure political relation, so that we can't easily use his nonfiction prose to supply an ethical or political template for the aggressively aesthetic poetry. But in fact, Poe's unusual strings, his poetry of intertextual appeal and suggestion, clearly anticipate the aesthetic emergency that we associate, for example, with Benjamin and Adorno. As Jonathan Elmer has shrewdly said and shown, any attempt to bracket or dissipate the formalist biases of Poe's own work risks dehistoricizing it. We can see Elmer's point more clearly if we recur once again to Shelley in his defense of poetry. Poe's work feeds upon the same nexus of cultural issues that led Shelley to call poets the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Shelley's essay is addressing the pamphlet that his friend Thomas Love Peacock published in 1820, The Four Ages of Poetry. As the title suggests, Peacock's cultural critique argued that history had exposed the inconsequence of poetry to an age of enlightenment and modernity. A poet in our times is a semi barbarian in a civilized community. He lives in the days of the past. Shelley's defense counter argued that the poetic imagination was the very basis of civilization. The barbarities of the present, only too real, were not the deeds of the poets, but of the anarchs who held positions of social and political power. Poetry and the principle of self, of which money is the visible incarnation, are the God and Mammon of the world. For Shelley, contemporary poets, the focus of Peacock's attack, were the particular glory of an age marked by an excess of the selfish and calculating principle. The cultivation of those sciences which have enlarged the limits of the empire of man over the external world has, for want of the poetical faculty, proportionally circumscribed those of the internal world, and man, having enslaved the elements, remains himself a slave. Shelley's enslaved men will emerge later as the beasts of Poe's marginalium. Although Poe did not involve himself in political controversy, his mordant view of American democracy overlaps the view that Shelley shared with his critical compatriot Jeremy Bentham. In the language of legitimacy and tyranny and of the venal slavery that crawls under them, democracy and anarchy are synonymous terms. Although readers commonly shrink from Poe's contemptuous view of American democracy, we should take it just as seriously as we take Whitman's sanguine views, as Whitman did. Given the terms of Poe's work, however, we will do that well, I believe, only if we stay focused on Poe's aesthetic surfaces. Shelleyan politics operates in Poe under the sign of what he called the poetic principle. No one doubts that Poe's musical poetica is deeply in debt to Shelley's theory of poetic imagination, as we have already seen. The central paragraph of Poe's essay, paragraph 14, calls out to a key pair of Shelley's poems, Adonai and One word is too often profaned, and carries as well a pervasive recollection of Shelley's defense. Both men treat poetry as a discourse for exposing the before unapprehended relations of things, or what Poe called the combinations and combinations of combinations. When Poe ignores Shelley's active commitment to social reform, he seems to have left poetry exposed to Peacock's principal charge of social inconsequence. In that view, Poe's aestheticism isn't barbarous, it's decadent. Without the first sign of moral principle, as Whitman's phrased his initial response to Poe's writing. But then Poe's whole project redefined the poetic expression of moral principle as didactic heresy. But then again, Ivor Winters, appalled at Poe's move, sought to further redefinition. A poem which is a poem and nothing more is for Winters empty and vacuous, and as such, a catastrophe for contemporary culture. What's up, Dormus? Although Winters disapproved the content of Shelley's poetry, he did not think it contentless or ethically catastrophic, but that was his judgment of Poe's aestheticism. What Winters couldn't see or perhaps couldn't accept was Poe's view that only through a strict attention to poetic form can a reader experience what a poem may be saying as an appearance of truth. In this perspective, the truth of poetry holds that all its expressions are forms of truth, appearances, illusions, and to the degree that they represent social forms, ideologies. The death of a beautiful woman is the most poetical subject in the world because that figuration, perhaps especially in the romantic aftermath of enlightenment, exposes the mortal limit to which poetry itself is subject. An important change, indeed even a catastrophic change, gets marked when Shelley's unacknowledged legislator consciously steps forth as the center and victim of his social milieu. See ya, bruv. The beautiful and ineffectual angel of history beating his wings in vain against the storm winds of the past. So conceived, the poet reflects the emergency of his moment in the language and media of the moment. In that respect, poetry's special privilege lies in the assumption it will always make that it has no special privilege to moral or political enlightenment. This does not mean for Poe that it affirms nothing and denies nothing, or that it takes no ideological positions. Poe is not, for example, a Christian, and he often puts his heretical ideas on clear display, not least of all in his poetry, as we shall see shortly when we look at The Sleeper. That he would not call his thoughts heretical is one of his more charming heresies. Poe's anti-didacticism is a plea to rethink the ancient idea of poetic mimesis. His argument holds that the function of poetry is to raise up a network of representations of the good and the bad and the worst and the best, the city and the sea, from a vantage in a language that announces itself to purely representational. The writing lays bare its imaginary condition. In that move, it lays bare as well the political imagery, the political imaginary of a world asleep in its inheritance of illusion. Chew. Consider The Sleeper, for example, and start with an anatomy of its narrative structure. Poe puts the ballad, his signature form, through many transformations from his earliest work, Al-Araf and Tamerlane, to his latest. Even the Bells tells the story, but for all their narrativity, the plots of the poems can appear simply preposterous or hard to get at, like The Raven. Assessing the story told in The Sleeper is a serious challenge. The difficulty becomes a foreground subject itself because the poem is such a clear mutation of the Sleeping Beauty legend, an extensive literary resource that is obviously cognate with the widely dispersed Beatrice legend. The death of a beautiful woman. That was cultural archive in the dominant feeding source for Poe's work, especially the poetry. In the case of The Sleeper, scholars have pointed to various possible influences, but like all of Poe's poetry, The Sleeper is such a literary echo chamber that specific identifications are less pertinent than grasping how the poem swerves from its inheritance. Tennyson's influence on Poe is especially important here. One thinks especially of his early poems, The Lady of Shalott, The Sleeping Beauty, and its companion poem, The Arrival, The Dying Swan, and The Sleeping Saint Cecily in the Palace of Art. Such poems explicitly connect beautiful women dead, dying, or sleeping with beauty, art, and their place in the sordid and just-in-time world. That Tennyson was extrapolating from the name Shelleyan inheritance from the same Shelleyan inheritance so important for Poe as commonplace knowledge. But while Tennyson underscores the aesthetic politics of these legendary materials, he does not radically alter the structure of the Sleeping Beauty legend any more than does Letitia Elizabeth Landon or other poets of that period who take it up. The core myth remains intact that beauty awaits the arrival of a hero, martial or theological, to set her free. Later writers, especially women bent on calling the core narrative to a revisionist political account, will move against the legend in significant ways. Angela Carter, Stevie Smith, and Helen Adam are notable. That the legend has very dark political implications, sleeping within it, so to say, is perhaps most apparent from how folklore was used for internal propaganda in Nazi Germany. The sleeper also moves sharply against the core legend, as we see from the speaker's growing alarm that the sleep of the Lady Bright isn't deep enough, that it should deepen into death. So fearfully haunted is the chamber in which she lies. The poem starts easily, if also strangely. Easily because a first person narrator comes forward to set a scene for the action to come. Strangely because the scene is profoundly irreal. We will shortly examine how that irreality is evoked. But for the moment, we must attend to the fracturing of the narrative. Having magically appeared in the poem at the end of stanza 1, Irene, the focus of the narrator's attention, is addressed directly throughout the second stanza. The move is preposterous because Irene, we know, lies sleeping with her destinies. That the line is itself preposterous because it will appear completely inexplicable when a reader first encounters it. The narrative turns yet more obscure as stanza 2 develops. Poe's Sleeping Beauty has unaccountably moved from her resting place in the universal valley to an indoor chamber with a latticed window thrown open to the night airs. Narrative obscurities multiply when the speaker suggests that the strange sleeper must have come to this place. Is it even an imaginable place any longer? From far off seas. Stanzas 3 and 4 then turn from directly addressing the lady to a prayer to God that she might somehow move yet again, this time from her latticed chamber to a more holy apartment. The final stanza changes the prayer to a simple hope that her sleep be more deep than any the narrator has so far imagined. He locates this within some tall vault in a far forest dim and old. A certain local narrative order emerges following stanza 2 when we glimpse the rationale for the narrator's prayer to God in stanza 3. The narrator prays that she might move to a chamber more holy and more melancholy because her latticed chamber is fearfully haunted. The move in stanza 3 briefly misleads us to imagine that the tale will follow a familiar, vaguely Christian narrative line, but the pale, sheeted ghosts have not been exorcised. So at last the lady is turned over to her final resting place in stanza 4. The move is in fact an eternal return. Irene's last vault is not a more holy spot cherished by God, but some sepulchre associated with the grand family funerals of her childhood. Resting with God, the narrative line briefly offered in stanza 3 is no longer the poem's hope. Difficult as that religious rejection would be, particularly for 19th century readers, more difficult still is the narrative as such, which turns startlingly particular at the end. Some sepulchre remote alone, against whose portal she hath thrown in childhood many an idle stone, some tomb from out whose sounding door she ne'er shall force an echo more. Thrilling to think, poor child of sin, it was the dead who groaned within. All the narrator could possibly know about the lady's family and her childhood game of stone throwing is not only left unexplained, the poem has made it unexplainable. Nonetheless, and this is the heart of the poetic action, the poem has told us precisely that unexplainable story by supplanting the authority of traditional narrative with the anti narrative of Irene with her destinies. The sleeper has not only has freed poetry from the fate of the known Sleeping Beauty narrative. It has done this by laying out and then moving past Irene's two best known legendary destinies as the sleeping princess awaking her prince in a towered chamber, stanza 2, and as the sleeping soul awaiting its heavenly redemption, stanza 3. Irene's true destiny is death, shockingly marked both as a wormy death and a death from which she will utter no responsive sound. The poem ends where that other fine late poem begins. The fever called living is conquered at last. As to death and the sleeper, however, Mabbott and other admiring readers find a serious problem with line 47. Soft may the worms about her creep. Morbid is the word of judgment. But while the judgment is entirely just if applied to the poem's speaker, that is to say, if we read the word as a psychological marker, the judgment fails, even comically fails, if read from the point of view the poem has achieved in its final stanza. The sleeper is no more authorized by its speaker than is the raven. Both speakers are the everyman of antebellum America, and perhaps, if we think forward to, say, Scott Fitzgerald of the American everyman tout court. Both speakers have been deranged by the experience of loss, and the poems use their narratives, the tales they tell, to track the sources of their derangement. In the speaker's experience, children of sin live in fear of the depths that haunt their lives. In the argument of the sleeper, however, children of sin live in fear of the depths that haunt their lives. But woe, 'tis so. The poetic argument is a judgment on the speaker's experience, and that critical differential is everything to the poem. The sound that comes back from the stone is merely an echo from the vault's metal door, but it is a sound that also speaks of something that is gone forever. The speaker's Irene, she is always his phantasm, does not want to hear the sound as such. She wants to hear it as the voice of the dead, because that sound would mitigate her loss, even if it would thereby also fearfully produce the pale-sheeted ghosts. Poe's poem argues against that deranged, if pitifully understandable expectation. The dead are precious as such. As J.T. Barbarese remarks, the detail of the thrown stones is a surprising touch of the everyday in all its phantasmagoria, and it points to what children do all the time. Far from undoing the uncanny force of the poem, however, that quotidian detail pushes it across the threshold of adult illusions about the everyday world. It has the same effect as the move Rimbaud makes at the climatic moment of Les Bateaux Ivres. Rimbaud's fantastical Papillon du Mai floats in the singing air of Poe's fantastical June vapor. They are hearing the same unheard song in the same unimagined season. I will not read the French because I can't. If I want a water of Europe, it is the black cold puddle where in the sweet-smelling twilight a squatting child full of sadness releases a boat as fragile as a May butterfly. Poe licenses a similar escape from commonplace narrative in his opening stanza, where the magical power of the legendary elixir called Nocta, unnamed in the text, generates a space-time fit for the arrival of Irene with her destinies. At midnight in the month of June, I stand beneath the mystic moon. An opiate vapor, dewy, dim, exhales from out her golden rim, and softly dripping drop by drop upon the quiet mountain top, steals drowsily and musically into the universal valley. The opening two lines mark the text as a kind of dream space, where the first person speaker is part of the scene and not, as in a romantic poem of self expression, its composer or observer. This I is distinctly Rimbaudin, an auteur, an element in a fantasia. Most important, the dream space emerges from a pair of intertexts. Thomas More's Lalla Rookh and Shakespeare's Macbeth supply the opiate vapor that pervades the place, the time, the phenomena, the person speaking, and the unfolding of their appearances. Furthermore, the intertext identify the vapor as purely magical, ethically indifferent. It is medicinal, and Shakespeare malignant. The vapor drains down through the lines from moon to space to air to mountain and finally into the universal valley. That phrase, that place, that line is the passage's astonishing summation. Not a Hegelian concrete universal, but a peculiar kind of concrete double universal, having negated that negation of imaginative vision commonly called reality. In that move, the line finally gains the identity it would otherwise lose through didactic reference. It gains, that is, the concrete particularity of the line itself, whose unique character is defined by its startling metrical form. 6 lines of steady four-stress iambs, briefly interrupted by the spondee in line 7, collapse altogether in a line that discovers its liberation by flaunting prosodic corruption. The line mocks all thought of normative scansion. The semantic value of its words are correspondingly shattered as the line joins together two general terms, one abstract, the other empirical. The jointure unhinges both from their general reference and binds them to a new anatomy. The consequence is most clearly marked by the term universal, whose reference is now fixed to the semantic field of the poem. In this poetic valley, a new world is being born, whole and entire, but entirely unlike the new world of John C. Calhoun or Henry Clay, and least of all like the imaginative representation springing up in the antebellum. No one in America in 1845 is writing poetry like this, and especially not in 1831 when Poe published the poem in its first version. Irene. The strong sense of a beginning in Poe, Williams truly says, is in no one else before him, that he anticipates by many years much of the work we've come to canonize, not least Rimbaud's, is important to see, but that will come merely as an academic surprise, at least to many American academics. Astonishment comes when we actually look closely at the language. Poe is building palaces with the threadbare and meretricious materials of Biedermeier romanticism, the lingua franca of his epic's cultural archive. No reader understood better what Poe was doing with his language than Mallarmé in his great tribute to Poe's poetry, the sonnet Les Tombeaux de Edgar Poe, 1876. An angel comes to explain the purpose of Poe's linguistic noir mélange, donner un sens plus puro mots de la tribu, to give a pure sense to his tribe's language. Mallarmé writes, La tribu, not le peuple, because he knew all well as Poe that, with respect to language and culture, the savages in America were not the Native Americans. Okay. Good workmen never quarrel with their tools. We might recall Byron's shrewd remark, Don Juan, one when reading Poe, who accepts the tools and materials served up to him in his magazinist culture. We know what he thought about his epic's beastliness, and we know how he strove to engage critically with its cultural voices. Nonetheless, he took his stand in the vulgarities of antebellum America. Did America at the time have other fairer faces to show? Indeed, it did. But then, do we actually think or want to think that poetry only comes from or for those faces? Poe has a more tender, if also a darker thought. The books of virtue are books of fear. God Himself has told us so. It is true, as the examples of Virgil and Dante insist, that great poetry can be made out of imperial and grandiose materials. It is also true that Persius and Cecco and Angiolari were great music makers, more significant in certain ways than those more celebrated contemporaries like Propertius and Cecco. Poe, or is it Cesso? I don't know. It's Cecco or Cesso. Poe works to save the appearances of the tawdry, the frail, the inconsequent, and even to suggest, as here, that it is dangerous to make distinctions about distinction. I guess Poe never read The Captivity of the Old Man Girls. I don't know what the fuck he read. Yet distinctions will and should be made, as they are made here in The Sleeper, where Christian ideology does not fare very well. But still, it fares forth, full of sympathy. Keko hated his father, and wrung from his hatred several immortal poems. How come I've never heard of this guy? Cecco. Is that Ciso? Secco? Keko? Certainly there is greater love than Keko had for his father, but reading his poems we remember how often we forget the intimate relation of love and hate. Reading The Sleeper, Whitman might well say what he said of the American heroes he celebrated. They're so, these irretrievable. That's it. That's all he said. These irretrievable. For in the end, all is lost except what we can save in our devoted, if also fractured, memories. Sarah Helen Whitman, one of Poe's best readers, several times commented on Poe's lingering pity and sorrow for the dead and a fear of having grieved them by some involuntary wrong of desertion or forgetfulness. No critical remark ever made about Poe seems to me more incisive. The point of Poe's great subject, mournful and never ending remembrance, is to attempt the impossible, to do the dead justice on their own terms. Annabel Lee, which I shall examine in detail below, is perhaps Poe's consummate effort to carry out that desire, but it is splendidly executed in The Sleeper as well, and the latter poem is particularly useful for showing how long Poe has been committed to this devotion. The child throwing stones at the vault in order to conjure an illusion of the presence of the beloved dead was the poem's final image in the poem's first version. Irene, how fixed Poe was on that image is apparent from another poem in his 1831 volume of poems, A Paean. This work, an early version of Lenore, makes the connection explicit between Poe's song and the futile effort to cancel ultimate loss. Thus, on the coffin loud and long, I strike the murmur sent. Through the gray chambers to my song shall be the accompaniment. But what is catastrophic about this style of poetic address? As Sir Philip Sidney might say, it affirms nothing and denies nothing. It simply represents the poetic act of representation. Becoming thus a pure performative, it demonstrates to the world its social function in the world. But note that Poe has turned that demonstration into something much more troubling than the appearance of Tennyson's Lady of Shalott to the lords and dames of Camelot. Both Tennyson and Poe annotate their representations, which therefore reflect not the world, but only other representations of the world, legendary intertext, and their primitive material support system, language, and media. The illusions of art and poetry represent the illusions the world has always known. Poetry is thus what Poe called the dream, the poem within a dream, the world. Poets legislate illusions from the illusions of the past. Poe and Tennyson both do this in the most self-conscious way, but there is a great difference between them. Dark as Tennyson's vision may be, the doom of romanticism indeed, Poe's is darker still. The doom of poetry itself, the doom of culture and its memory. Poetis et poems mortis. But then we must remember poems and poets still. The specifically critical character of Poe's demonstration is therefore doubled. On the one hand, its implicit attack on the illusions of any realist or normative discourse, however sympathetic; on the other, beyond that and worse, its explicit, its performative exposure of itself. The haunted, ominous, and fearful representation in Poe's work reflect a world living off a massive inheritance of or misrecognized illusions. Hence, the moral of the work: those who cannot remember their illusions are condemned to pursue them, and so are those, Poe in fact, who do remember, mournful and never-ending remembrance, because their memories will always be drawn from the archive of illusions. No one can escape the threat they literally represent. Those who remember cherish the dead. Some, like the child in Wordsworth, We Are Seven, don't have to remember because the dead for them are not gone and never will be. But when the catastrophe of the beautiful occurs, when the loved become the forever lost, the official recorders of human life, the poets, plunge in the crisis. Scholars, we official secondary readers, call that crisis romanticism and have tracked its proposals for living with the consciousness of ultimate loss. From Wordsworth to Yeats and even beyond comes this message of shared sympathy. Man is in love and loves what vanishes. Not without hope we suffer and we mourn. Wordsworth, elegiac stanzas. The importance of Poe and Rimbaud, in fact, the reason one gets cast out and the other secedes, lies in their indifference to messages of comfort. They are primitives like children. An adult person, they know the loved are lost, but as children they refuse to let them go, not even to that land of limbo, Beulah land, the realm of eternal sympathy. Byron's Giaour and the wife in Frost's home burial have pledged them tormented allegiance, but so has the blithe spirit of We Are Seven. Poe's work celebrates the impossible marriage of a tormented and a complacent mind, but the marriage is not consummated until he writes Annabel Lee. Before looking closely at that culminant work, however, I want to reconsider another of Poe's notorious late works, The Bells. This is the poem in which form is everything, the poem that perhaps more than any led Emerson to his sneering misjudgment of Poe as the Jingle Man. I mean, he was the Jingle Man. And that's where we're stopping because that's roughly half point. Got anything to say? Say it. Otherwise, I'm going to eat some cereal. You look at Eddie. You just look at his mustache. Look at my mustache, bro. My stush mash. Get over there and look at him. Look at him. Some bitch. Hey, what do you got, buddy? What do you got? My big turned head. Oh, it ain't easy reading. It ain't easy, boy. My old grandpapa taught me. Put a straw in your mouth for sustenance when you get tired from reading, boy. Hey, look. The item is currently in transit to the destination. My fucking ledger better show up tomorrow. It's in Detroit. It better show up tomorrow. I'm in a rage. Where is all tracking? Your item arrived at our USPS facility in Detroit, Michigan. Distribution center on July 23rd, 2025 at 1:07 a.m. The item is currently in transit to the destination. Like I said, it better be at my post office in the morning, or you can all fucking go to hell. I will not tolerate anything less than delivery. Deliver it! Deliver it! Deliver me, Brubs! What happened there? Channel activity. Channel activity post. Show the chat. There we go. What happened, bro? I can't see chat on there. It is. Oh shit! Oh man. Oh man. I need some cereal or something. Ah. Hey, I'm 10 years old and I'm following your channel. Thanks. Alright. I guess that's it. No one's saying anything. No one's talking? Yeah, I'll just crunch on her. Just crunch some cereal. Give you some ASMR. 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 Or if saying ASMR over and over is still ASMR. Asmer. Asmer. Asmer tomorrow, buddy. If it's AMSR. Yeehaw. ASMR. ASMR. Oh, man. I'm tired. ASMR. ASMR. ASMR, ASMR. ASMR is kind of like the S&M of words. Hey, ASMR. ASMR. ASMR.
After Mom passed, my sister and I, we realized that
Hey, it's Aaron's estate sales.
after Mom passed, my sister and I, we realized that we really needed a very quality estate sale company to handle that. When they entered the home, they were not intimidated. It was like a weight was lifted. It just really felt good to put that in the hands of professionals. They were like a partner in a very delicate and sensitive transaction. I would recommend Aaron's Estate Sales to anyone that is in need of this type of service.
Hell yeah.